Welcome, everybody, to the first in hopefully what will become a series of Migration Scholar Collaborative talks. Today, we are going to be focusing on Haiti and the long history of brutality by Border Patrol on the US-Mexico border, as well as the longer history of Haitian migration to the United States and responses by the US government. The Migration Scholar Collaborative, otherwise known as MiSC, is a group of migration scholars who seek to bring our academic research to a wider audience. And today we're very lucky and pleased to have with us three amazing scholars who are part of MiSC. Monica Martinez, who is at the University of Texas, Austin, and her book, The Violence Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, documents a lot of the kind of violence that has been occurring on the border for more than a century. We also have Carl Lindskoog from Raritan Valley Community College. His book, Detain and Punish: Haitian Refugees and the Rise of the World's Largest Immigration Detention System, is an excellent history that understands the Haitian migration in the 1970s and 80s as kind of the beginning of what we know today as this massive expansion in the immigrant detention system. And finally, Yael Schacher, who is working with Refugees International, is working on a forthcoming book on the history of asylum and is in Washington, D.C., very close to the advocacy and policy work that is going on there. So without further ado, let me ask the first question and I'll have all of our panelists hopefully chime in. We've all seen the horrific images of Haitians being chased by Border Patrol agents on horseback this week. Was the arrival on the Haitians on the border and the reaction by the Border Patrol or the public outcry to the images that we saw a surprise to you? And let's start with Carl, since he wrote the book.
Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this exciting discussion. I think that it was surprising how so many people arrived so suddenly, and then all of a sudden there's this sort of standoff at the border. But of course, many people were aware that Haitian asylum seekers had been coming to the US-Mexico border for some years and failing to achieve asylum, or even often the ability to apply for asylum. And so it was not surprising that there would be some kind of big standoff and that there would be eventually a big crisis, because this has been going on for some years. I also was shocked and horrified, but also not completely surprised by the treatment of those people who were crossing the river and trying to escape. I was more surprised by the public reaction and that it generated so much attention, because a lot of people have been trying to draw attention to the situation of Haitian asylum seekers along the US-Mexico border and elsewhere for a long time. And it seems like it was an important time for people who weren't paying attention to sit up and take note, but it's just the optics of one terrible incident or moment of violence also kind of obscures a much longer, even recent history of violence towards Haitian asylum seekers and other asylum seekers along the US-Mexico border and elsewhere.
Thanks. And that is a perfect segue to Monica and her work on the longer history of that violence on the US-Mexico border. So what did you see in this past week, Monica, that either echoes the past or is different from the past?
Yeah, I mean, it was to echo Carl's point, it was deeply troubling and upsetting to see those photographs, but it wasn't surprising. I mean, on the one hand, there's a long history of law enforcement and vigilantes using force and violence against people, civilians, unarmed civilians, in cases American citizens, but especially migrants and refugees along the US-Mexico border. It's been a place where the US government, where the state of Texas, but also local communities have tried to show force to restrict the movement of people. And in some cases, those were, if we go back to the 1800s, with the establishment of the Texas Rangers in 1823, this was a force, a group that was called to action to quote unquote protect Anglo settlers, and what historians described as a race war for white supremacy, to establish and protect Anglo settlers, and the enemies that they were quote unquote fighting against were Mexican landowners, indigenous people, native nations, but Texas Rangers also developed a reputation for putting their quote unquote hunting skills to use to hunt enslaved people who were seeking freedom by leaving the state of Texas. And so there's a long history of the use of force, of the criminalization of civilians, and the policing of the movement of people of color. That is in contrast to the free movement of white Americans to move into Mexico, to in some cases the military. But this is also was not surprising because in Texas, the governor just signed a piece of legislation to give almost $2 billion to militarizing the border, to sending the Texas National Guard. And so, these images of the rows of Texas DPS parked along the border, it is just another restaging of power, and at the expense of refugees and asylum seekers. But the visual photographs of a law enforcement agent on horseback, charging at unarmed people, is a photograph that we have seen throughout history in different contexts. We can think about the Jim Crow South. We can think about the long history of these kinds of acts of violence on the US-Mexico border. But really what stings and what people have been asking about is why that photograph was so unsettling. And I think it is because it reminds us of these ongoing histories of brutality by law enforcement, the long cultures of impunity, and especially for migrants, undocumented people, asylum seekers. They are the most vulnerable to violence, and they have little access to retribution.
So you mentioned the Department of Public Safety, the Texas forces, and I'm wondering if or could speak to sort of the collaboration, the interaction between Texas law enforcement agents versus the Border Patrol, a federal agency.
Well, the history of it is quite intimate. That there were in 1924, when when the U.S. Border Patrol was created, that there were Texas Rangers who were founding members of the Border Patrol. It was Texas congressmen that called for the creation of the Border Patrol. And the Texas Rangers also, before the Border Patrol was created, they were models for other state police forces like the Arizona Rangers. And so this brutal policing culture was then adopted by the federal government. And so it is a history that was inspired by the rise of anti-immigrant nativist sentiment. Some of the same congressmen that were calling for the Border Patrol were calling for eugenicists to come and testify. So we have to think critically about the history of white supremacy and nativism in inspiring the expansion of this police force. But in Texas, the relationship between the governor and the current administration is different from the relationship between the governor and the Trump administration. But it is a question about where is the federal government when you have a Texas governor, deputizing his state police or local law enforcement to quote unquote do the work of the federal government. And again, the policies that are being enforced, it's all quite complicated, but it's we're seeing the dire consequences of inaction, I think, from the federal government in changing policies.
Yeah, so Yael, this sort of thinking about the federal government, you being in Washington, you're obviously at Refugees International following these refugee or asylum seeker crises or arrivals on a daily basis. What did you see that was different or maybe the same about the arrival of the Haitians in Del Rio?
Well, two things. One, picking up on what Monica just said, which is about this kind of strained relationship that the Biden administration has with Texas. In other forums, Texas is suing the Biden administration for other immigration-related policies and preventing the Biden administration from making changes that it wanted to make since the Trump administration. So it's sort of like this weird dynamic. But I think, as Monica mentioned, perhaps one of the reasons for the spectacular speed with which the Biden administration came and cleared the camp and sort of made this sort of a deterrent spectacle, sending a message, do not come, by like doing this so quickly and galvanizing, sending those pictures, because that at the end of the day, I think is part of the spectacle of it, is this idea that if we are brutal enough and we are fast enough in the way we handle migrants and asylum seekers who cross the border, perhaps in the administration's mind, more people will not come. This deterrent framework, which essentially controls policy, and has controlled sort of the way the administration has, approached Haitians in particular since the 1980s, if not before 1970s. So, but I think, there's the fact that the administration is worried about another push from Texas to say, why aren't you doing anything? Why aren't you doing anything? Because that's what Texas is constantly saying. You're not patrolling the border. In fact, you're letting so many people in and not doing enough, Biden. We're going to do it ourselves. We're going to send in our own people. We're going to, run basically a shadow immigration system. And I think Monica's absolutely right. They're using the same tactics at the end of the day, but actually it becomes this like race to who can do more enforcement, if you think about it, because of that dynamic, to the detriment, of course, to the asylum seekers themselves, who are subject to sort of, and in Del Rio, there's essentially a tent set up outside the sheriff's office for this Operation Lone Star, where essentially Texas is arresting on criminal misdemeanor charges with the help of ranchers, people for crossing the border without authorization. It's just a shadow system. And then eventually, if they are at the end of the day, if they are deemed guilty of it, then because they're now criminals, they have a criminal offense on their record beyond unauthorized entry, they're a priority for enforcement by DHS as criminals. So then they're sent to ICE. So it's all working together. It's just that, I think the fact that there's this push from Texas to do more just makes the Biden administration feel like it has to do more, and it's just a race to the horrible bottom in terms of enforcement. And the last thing, one other extra issue I wanted to throw into the mix was about a month ago, there was some horrible footage of a Haitian father carrying a child trying to move north from Tapachula in southern Mexico, and the Mexican National Guard, essentially 10 Mexican National Guards, pushing him down, throwing him onto the ground, and a Mexican immigration officer actually kicking him in the face. And I just want to, for me, I haven't seen that image, and knowing the sort of relationship that the migration authorities, essentially in other countries of the Americas, have been involved with in patrolling essentially the mobility of the Haitian diaspora in the Americas, is something that wasn't surprising me. It's just that this was sort of, I'm starting to see variants on a theme here, where there's brutal enforcement, especially of Black migrants, and people coming from what's called like, extracontinental, not coming from the hemisphere, coming from Africa or coming from Haiti, in Mexico, and sort of strict visa policies in other countries in the Americas to try to essentially push Haitians and other Africans out, and to work together on enforcement. And so there's sort of like an enforcement collaboration going on, especially in the Panama, which is sending all kinds of biometrics straight to the US government whenever anybody comes through. So I see this. So I'm not to minimize the deep roots of this enforcement tradition in the United States, but I actually think we're also seeing kind of variants of it in other countries in the Americas as well.
So I want to pick up on one part of your analysis, which is that the images were in some ways part of the administration policy or intent. And I guess the way I have seen this last week is a big black eye for the Biden administration and having to basically come out and say, we're going to investigate, this was wrong. So are you saying that this was sort of a byproduct of those images, or that they in fact intended this brutality to be publicized as a deterrent?
I mean, I don't think that, I honestly don't. I think Mayorkas, Homeland Secretary Mayorkas, was not prepared for the Border Patrol on horses. So I don't think it was like something that they wanted. They didn't want that kind of image. What they wanted was a corralling of all the Haitians coming over into a small space, into a camp that could be efficiently gotten rid of. And that message of speedy expulsion would serve as a deterrent. I think what they couldn't control for, or at least the people in Washington couldn't control for, is what Monica was talking about, which is the sort of entrenched racism in the culture of the Border Patrol and many of the officers who work for the Border Patrol. Not to say that Mayorkas doesn't have the responsibility to rein that agency in. It's just that sometimes he assumes the best of the people who work for him. And I'm not sure that that's well placed.
Yeah, so that brings us to Carl, who maybe could talk about, who's done a lot of research and written this book, Detain and Punish, on that longer history of Haitian migration to the United States. And maybe some people aren't as familiar what happened in the 1970s and 80s. What was the US government response to the arrival of tens of thousands of Haitians at that time?
Yeah, definitely. So when the significant numbers of so-called Haitian boat people began coming to Florida's shores in the early to mid 1970s, there was this racist reaction, which because people didn't want Black Haitians in their communities in Florida, and they started putting pressure on local and state officials, who in turn put pressure on those in Washington to try to do something to keep these people from coming, or if they're here, to keep them out of their communities. So they developed something called the Haitian program, which was sort of a layered campaign to speaking to Yael's point right now, to deter them through punishment. And so if they came here successfully, you put them in local jails and you incarcerate them. You deny them the right to work so that they can't have a means of living. And then they applied a blanket denial of asylum claims and mass deportation, basically. And that was basically the government's response until there was a successful legal challenge where a federal judge declared that this was not only discriminatory, but blatantly racist. This was the first group of Black asylum seekers or refugees to come here, and no one else had been treated this way. It's clear-cut racism. But despite that ruling striking down the Haitian program, first the Carter administration and then its successor, the Reagan administration, found ways to continue doing what they were doing. And so they continued the policy of detaining Haitian asylum seekers who came. And there was continued to be a wholesale violation of their rights because they were discriminatory and in a biased way denied asylum claims. Just to get to the point of deterrence, it's clear if you look at the historical documents that this was all about deterring Haitians and other asylum seekers, because until about 1980, when you had this mass arrival of Cuban and Haitians asylum seekers, there wasn't really much of an asylum process in place. And the people who didn't want to see large numbers of asylum seekers showing up on America's doorstep and applying for asylum said, you know, now it's Haitians, today it's Haitians, but tomorrow it's going to be Central Americans and then the world. We have to put in a punishing enough system that will keep people from even coming here in the first place, especially because our federal and international law require acknowledgement of their rights as asylum seekers. One interesting thing that's similar and also different of what's going on now, and when we compare it to the history of the 1970s and 80s, is the tool that's being used to deny them asylum. So today it's primarily Title 42, and it's this pretext or this justification of the public health crisis, which of course Trump introduced and then the Biden administration is continuing to use. Its purpose, of course, is to be able to expel people before they can get in the asylum system and seek their rights to seek asylum. In the 1970s, it was detention and just denial of asylum, you know, just a blanket denial of asylum. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration introduced what's called the Haitian Interdiction Program. So it was Coast Guard cutters sailing and meeting ships of Haitian asylum seekers before they could get here so that they couldn't get on American soil and apply for asylum. If they got here, again, it was put them in jails and detention centers and then figure out a way to get rid of them. But from the Haitian program of the 70s through the incarceration and other violence carried out on Haitians in the 80s, in the 1990s, we have Guantanamo as an offshore processing and detention facility, another means by which to keep Haitian asylum seekers from getting here before they can fully exercise their rights. All of those are just the predecessors to today's use of Title 42. So today we happen to be in a global pandemic. That's the useful way to do what we want to do to keep Haitians out, but there have been other methods, tools, weapons that have been used against them in the past.
Yeah, and the latest statistics on Title 42 expulsion suggest that more people have actually at this point been expelled under Title 42 by Biden than by Trump. He has accelerated the pace of those expulsions. So that's something I think we could talk about in terms of responses. What can we do as academics? What can advocates in Washington do? What are they doing to try to address not only this Haitian situation of Haitians on the border, but migrants in general who are being expelled in the hundreds of thousands, now over 1 million migrants being expelled without access to their legal right to claim, to petition for asylum. So I do want to get to Yael, but before we get to Yael on that issue, I wanted to ask Monica, because you're on the ground in the state of Texas. What's going on in Texas about this issue, and how are people mobilizing there to address it?
Well, unfortunately, you know, well, I mean, Texas is an urgent place for people to be paying attention to in terms of what the state is doing, what police in Texas are doing, what the Border Patrol is doing here in Texas. But as usual, as it has been taking place for over a century, it is everyday people and activists and advocates who are trying to put the pieces of broken humanity back together. And so one of the most uplifting things that I've seen today are photographs of people in El Paso welcoming asylum seekers into their community. It reminds us, right, that the anti-immigrant rhetoric, that rhetoric that is criminalizing asylum seekers is not, that's not what everybody believes in Texas, and so communities are welcoming and opening their doors to provide resources. I think it is, you know, one of the, if we think about the history of this tough stance on border security, it's also important to remember that this is not just a Republican issue that Democratic administrations for decades have been performing this, being tough on border security and making it a part of their political platforms. And so we can think about policies like Operation Gatekeeper, put into practice by the Clinton administration, that had such continues to have devastating effects on people trying to reach the United States. And so if we think about the thousands of people that have died by crossing the Arizona Sonora desert, and the 1,000 people that have died by trying to cross into Texas, that this idea of deterrence, this practice of deterrence, does not work. And it stands in the faith of the truth, which is that people are being recruited to come here, that we depend and rely on migrant labor to keep our society functioning. And so much of what I think is and there's a historical patterns to this, that the creation of the Border Patrol in 1924 was in so many ways a response to the refusal to have quotas on how many Mexicans could enter into the United States. And so it's this process of using border enforcement for different ends at different times. In some cases, the Border Patrol actively looked away from the open recruitment of migrant labor into the Southwest. In other decades, it was used to round up and deport people. And so we are in this moment where, Americans, I think, are finally starting to put the pieces together, that when we see the kinds of violent policing, that it reminds us that the Border Patrol and federal police are committing acts of injustice and violence that we should be calling for changes. But I also think that something else that's happening in Texas that is it is still unnerving, is the private detention centers and the detentions that are taking place on military bases, like at Fort Bliss. Just around the time of the second anniversary of the El Paso massacre, there were more whistleblower reports about the inhumane conditions that unaccompanied minor children are being exposed to at places like Fort Bliss, where children, teenage girls are being put on suicide watch, where children were being denied basic things like clean underwear. I mean, I think that when we are, that photograph of a Border Patrol agent on horseback is troubling, but I'm also really concerned about what we don't see. And because we have to think about this all within the context of the Department of Homeland Security, there's more that we don't see. And to Yael's point, this is also not just something that we have to be concerned about what's taking place in the United States, in our own hometowns, but also what US policies are making happen in other parts of the world. And so I think we have to think about reform, immigration reform, needed reform urgently, to stop the kinds of human rights violations that are happening in our name.
So the question of, the deterrence is not working, has never worked, and whether this question of the system is broken, or is the system functioning just as it was designed? In other words, is the goal really by the policymakers not really deterrence, but rather kind of creating a death machine, creating a machine to torture and create an exploitable labor force? I mean, what do you think in terms of what the motivations and intentions of policymakers have and continue to be? Monica, that was.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I hope that we can all speak to that, but, there's a lot of money being put into police enforcement and into these deterrence practices. And so when we think about the use of funds, being tough on border security, creating the fear of a threat that could slip through the border, it all fuels the funding to this machine. And so when we think about the billions of dollars that are being spent on policing, we should all be shocked and unsettled by how much money is going to create harm. But I think it is also just another opportunity in which we see fear being used to dehumanize different groups of people. And so it is another practice of creating these boundaries over around who we consider to be worthy of citizenship, who we consider to be the future of the United States, and creating these restrictions. And so it is, what I am also shocked by is there's a lot of social media of different police departments, different counties in the state of Texas, where sheriffs, take photographs of their work through this Operation Lone Star, and to the point of the work of sociologists who said, each apprehension is used to justify the need for more funding, for more policing. And all of that is just distraction, really, from what are humane and common sense solutions to changes that we can make for immigration reform. That the sort of public spectacle, the photographs, the militarization, it all fuels this call, this criminalization of migrants and asylum seekers, that really makes it difficult to have conversations about how could this be different.
Yeah, so turning now to Washington, what we've heard from the Biden administration from Mayorkas is that there's going to be an investigation. Biden said, the people responsible will be held accountable, and an investigation into the use of horses. And I'm wondering what the advocacy groups in Washington, including yourself, Yael, I saw your Twitter thread on what Biden could do right now to address the humanitarian situation, or the inhumanitarian situation that's been created by Border Patrol.
Yeah, so there are definitely some concrete steps. And if I could just say, I think to answer your $900 million question about why the government uses deterrence that you asked, Monica, I mean, I think that the perception of being in control is what's driving Washington. And if that means that it's inhumane and it treats asylum seekers, that's not the point. And so if that needs to, if cruelty, so I'm not sure if cruelty is the point always, but if it's the byproduct of trying to maintain this control, that's fine, right? It's not something that is going to stop that desire to maintain control. And of course, the border is not something you can actually control. It's a lot of optics, so it's going to lead to abuses. So I think part of the frustration also, and why this has sort of grabbed attention in the way it has in Washington, is that Biden made a lot of promises, and the immigration community, 100%, the deterrence strategy has been a bipartisan one. As was mentioned, Clinton was the president who fought in the Supreme Court to get the legal ruling that interdiction on the high seas was fine. And that's now, policy all, in the United States, that you don't even have to screen people. You could just send them back to their home countries on the high seas. So that was Clinton's Justice Department that fought for that. So I think when Biden came in, he promised to make some reforms, especially to the asylum system, and he promised to reverse some of Trump's policies. And in fact, he started reversing some of Trump's policies, like the Remain in Mexico one, which actually got a lot of the border communities into these coalitions of shelters, like in El Paso that Monica mentioned, to start welcoming people that were going to be paroled in to the United States. And there's this huge shelter in Houston that's now welcoming Haitians that have been sent there. And that's because there was this, people started, getting ready for this reversal that has now not happened, especially with Title 42. And then you also have, the Congress right now. There's a lot of desire to try to get immigration reform through. Biden, to the immigration reform question, Biden proposed a bill, and there are other bills on the floor to get dreamers and people with temporary protected status and others to be able to regularize their status in the United States. And that has sort of it's not going to happen. And there's an effort to do it through the budget process, through this reconciliation process. That's also not going to happen likely. And I think the frustration about that is also like on top. So people are frustrated that nothing has happened. There are certain Trump policies that are still in place. Biden administration continues to actually sue to keep Title 42 in place. So he's appealing rulings to keep that in place. So there's just not enough. And then you also have congressional committees, powerful ones in the House that are controlled by, are chaired by African Americans. Chairman Meeks, Chairman Thompson, they chair the House Foreign Affairs Committee, they chair the House Homeland Security Committee, and they're asking Biden, now, finally, what is this Title 42? How are you treating Haitians like this? And galvanizing the Congressional Black Caucus and others to really say, like, what's going on? And it's been, there were people in the Congressional Progressive Caucus who have been pushing back against Title 42 this whole time, but it didn't really, there wasn't a lot. I mean, there was a little, but it wasn't really taking hold as an issue that a lot of really powerful Democrats like Chuck Schumer and Dick Durbin in Chicago were really taking down. And now with this incident that happened, Chuck Schumer went on the floor of the Senate and talked about this. That is a huge change. So that was something that was finally happening. I think it comes from his frustration that his immigration reform is going nowhere, right? Like nothing is happening for him. So that's one. There is this congressional strategy that a lot of groups have in Washington to push members of Congress to really take this on as an issue: asylum reform, Title 42, Border Patrol abuses, reforming the Border Patrol. Then there are groups like Undocumented Black, Haitian Bridge Alliance, and others, BAJI, which is a Black immigrant rights organization, and African immigrant rights organizations that are saying that, calling for DHS to do more rigorous investigations, and actually even for those, give people, anybody who hasn't been expelled to Haiti yet, let them in, because they can be witnesses of the abuse, they can testify about abuse, they can get immigration relief as a result of being those witnesses. In other words, like, let's not just investigate, but let's actually get some accountability. Let's actually get people who, were victims of this abuse to actually get some reparation. Like, this is not just like an investigation. We need some reparation. We need some accountability. So there's a movement there, and it's unclear really how far it will go, but there's been an effort to get the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Division, and which is part of the Homeland Security, sort of an internal investigatory body, and members of Congress to do oversight hearings about this and really hold people accountable. The last thing I'll mention is, Monica's last point about U.S. policy sort of in the world. Unfortunately, maybe some of you heard, like Haiti has been designated for temporary protected status, and the designation happened this summer, and it was about sort of, the conditions in Haiti, gangs in Port-au-Prince, the assassination of the president, the earthquake that happened this summer, making it unstable. But unfortunately, the cutoff for TPS, in other words, you have to have gotten here before the end of July to qualify, which seems very arbitrary to most people because the situation in Haiti has just gotten worse since then. So again, it kind of raises for people, again, the inadequacy of the measures that we have in place to deal with this situation. Like TPS is not going to really manage it. And the State Department, there's sort of this internal fight going on between the special envoy to Haiti, who wrote a letter and resignated in protest because he thought it was absurd that the U.S. should be criticizing American foreign policy in Haiti and also criticizing the flights. I mean, this was just crazy. Haiti is a humanitarian and political crisis, and now you're sending people back there. The Haitian government doesn't even want to deal with it. I mean, this is crazy. But immediately, Secretary of State Blinken pushed back and said no, and so did Secretary Mayorkas, said, nope, we've deemed Haiti to be fine, to be safe. And not only that, now he's meeting with the Foreign Affairs Minister from Mexico, Ebrard, about how to coordinate with Mexico on enforcement efforts. So another effort that people in Washington are pushing back on that, like on this idea of Haiti being a safe country to return people. How can we, raise country conditions? How can we make the State Department understand? And there are sympathetic elements within the State Department, mostly ones who focus on humanitarian affairs and our aid, aid to earthquake victims. But there's been like this box in the State Department, we give humanitarian aid, but it's completely separate from, this immigration policy, and in some ways enabling it, because now the focus has shifted to like, how can the International Organization of Migration, which gets a lot of funding from the State Department, essentially make it for a humane reception of the people the United States is now expelling, which is not the point, right? Which is not the point. So, there's a lot going on here, but the idea that the United States should also, one of the prongs in the plan was that the United States was going to talk to Brazil, was going to talk to Chile, from where the Haitians had lived for many years before, and see if they can work something out. And I'm worried and skeptical that that is not going to go the right direction, is not going to go the direction towards regularizing status, uniting families. But that would be the goal. The goal beyond, ending Title 42, stopping the Biden administration from suing for Title 42, allowing the people who are the Haitians subject to the encampment and abuse to come into the country and to be paroled into the country, just like we're paroling thousands of Afghans right now into the country without, we haven't really screened before they got here. So we're sort of paroling people in and dealing with it when they get here. We also need like a larger discussion about, asylum, not sending people back to their home countries, legal pathways for migration, and like something beyond cooperation on enforcement in the Americas, which is essentially all we have right now, and nothing to really talk about. Forced displacement, many of the Haitians will not meet the refugee definition. Even if we allowed them to seek asylum in the United States, we gave them fair procedures, which we're not, and they deserve it. They will not qualify for it. We need other forms of pathways, humanitarian protections, a much more expanded definition of who should be entitled to some sort of legal pathway to the United States than we have now, because the system is, especially within environmental migration and climate displacement and things like this. I mean, we really need to, that's what we should be coordinating on and thinking fresh ideas with other countries in the Americas. And I so that's another thing, another like kind of big picture thing that some advocacy groups are pushing on. So there's domestic pieces and sort of more global ones.
Okay, I want to bring Carl in here on the question of sort of the system and how it's designed and what its function is.
Yeah, thank you. I was intrigued by that question and also Monica and Yael's response. So I'm happy to do that. But also I just want to quickly say, I appreciate how Yael just connected a lot of the dots, and especially pointing out the contradiction and the irrationality of extending TPS up till July 29. And then, I listened to the interview with Mayorkas when he blatantly says, it wasn't before July 29 and now it is, but there's no evidence, there's no justification really. It's kind of one of those, the emperor has no clothes moment, because it's just like clear how blatantly it's just about power and not really for what the policy was designed to be. So thinking about, what's the sort of grand strategy, I think we should point out that there's always this combination of sort of America's interest in the world and capital's interest, and then also domestic politics, right? And I think sometimes, and it's hard to untangle, historians have sometimes done a good job explaining this, but sometimes it's still unclear. We've been talking about Clinton a lot. I think about how when Clinton was running for presidency, he promised to undo the cruel treatment of George H.W. Bush's direct return to Haiti of Haitian asylum seekers. And then when he got elected, he did this about face, and I think it was because he came under a lot of pressure. There's this racist and xenophobic right wing, and he did his triangulation and calculation and just said, I'm going to take a political hit, but it might be worse if we continue to allow Haitians to come and more people seek asylum here. So there's that domestic political piece. But what I really wanted to say first is I was doing an interview earlier this week, and the person had read and brought up the Abolish Migrant Prisons manifesto that Elliott and I co-authored. And she asked me, really, like, is that really a thing? How would that work? And why do you even think that that's like sort of the conclusion that we need to come to? And so we had a conversation about neoliberalism and how when capital can move freely and go wherever and human beings can't, it just creates this system, which a lot of people have argued and observed, of global apartheid. And that's part of why I think, is there's sometimes this big push and sometimes showed for deterrence or border enforcement. It's about allowing capital to continue to seek profit, and it requires the limited movement of people. Otherwise, that will have a more equalizing effect. And I think just to Yael, one other point Yael brought up about the climate catastrophe that we're already living through, as resources become more scarce and habitable land is, less and less, the powerful nations and the centers of empire are going to increasingly need to restrict movement of people. And I think they're seeing the future and they're understanding that this is the world that we are in and are continuing to go in. And that's part of these episodes, like we saw in El Paso as well.
Thanks, Carl. And, I'm glad you had that conversation with the journalist. Yes, abolishing migrant prisons is a thing. And yes, some of us do believe they should be abolished. That's a good segue to talk about the ways in which this incident on the border with the Haitians raised the whole question of anti-Blackness in immigration policies historically, as well as the overlap with the movement to abolish prisons for citizens and not just immigrants in the country, and the overwhelming disproportionate presence of Black and brown people in the nation's prison system. So Monica, I don't know if you could speak maybe to the history of anti-Blackness in US immigration policy.
Sure. Well, I think I think it's important to think about the ways in which the histories of anti-Black and anti-Mexican histories have been so segregated, and the missed opportunities to see the way in which they're intimately connected. And so one of the ways in which, if we think about the Texas Rangers again, that, they're participating in acts of racist violence to restrict the movement of Indigenous people back and forth across the border, but also Mexicans. But they're also working to try to prevent Black bodies from moving south into Mexico. And so it is, I think we should always be thinking about how intentional the anti-Black and racist violence is being used in policing. I think about the year in 1919 when there's a call to investigate abuses by the Texas Rangers. It's brought forward by J.T. Canales, and he helps to expose acts of racism and violence by the state police. Not just anti-Mexican violence, but also anti-Black violence. But as a response, the failure to hold accountable not just agents who committed murders and organized massacres and tortured prisoners, to hold individual agents accountable, but they also failed to hold leadership accountable. So the Adjutant General of the Texas Rangers. And so it's really this moment where you see then that failure to change the culture of policing has an effect in how it becomes expanded when Texas Rangers join the Border Patrol. But it also is this moment in failure where you see the Texas Rangers then very quickly shifting their attention, not just from policing anti-Mexican acts of anti-Mexican violence on the US-Mexico border, but then participating in acts of anti-Black violence against labor organizers, against anti-lynching activists, and against the NAACP. So I think there has been this interconnected history in which immigration, policing on the border and policing of civilians are interconnected that we've overlooked. But I'd ask Carl to speak more about the role of anti-Blackness in shaping anti-Haitian policies in the 70s and 80s, because I think that that's, as a public, we are becoming more adept at peeling back the cloak of legal authority when we see law enforcement committing acts of abuse. And I think that we are increasingly starting to see people understand that abuse can happen by law enforcement and is happening, unfortunately, by Border Patrol agents. But I think that still, when we think about immigration and policing, people don't understand that it's also a Black issue. And so I'd want to turn the mic over to Carl.
Carl.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that I think about a lot in trying to understand what happens with Haitians in the 1970s and 80s is this larger moment of racist backlash to the civil rights struggles and the liberation movements of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. That really, I think, informed the government's response towards the arrival of large numbers of Black asylum seekers. You know, and it happens in South Florida, which is having its own particular moment with that. But, you know, the Reagan administration, which really sort of resurrected and constructed the modern detention system in a certain way, is doing all kinds of other things. If you connect the dots regarding African Americans, regarding race, you know, reasserting and supporting white supremacist and racist things all over, you know, the immigration detention system as it developed, of course, is doing so in tandem with and intertwined with the rise of the larger racialized mass incarceration system. And really in a very similar time period, the major pieces of legislation that allowed for the mass incarceration of Black Americans, Black and Brown Americans, and the criminalization of immigration that very disproportionately put Black migrants and asylum seekers and Brown migrants and asylum seekers into detention, and sometimes the very same jails and prisons. You know, that's happening at the same moment, and it's the same politics that produces the racist, white supremacist police state that becomes a mass incarceration state, and the immigration detention and criminalization regime. And so I think, you know, looking both at the policies and how partly directed towards, you know, native-born Americans and some foreign-born people, how they overlap and reinforce each other, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, I think that can help us sort of see the connections between these two things.
Yeah, and the other thing I was reminded of is 1924, you have these national quotas, which do also exclude Black people from the country. But then 1965, in response to civil rights legislation, there is this Immigration Act, which gets rid of national quotas. So on the face of it is racially neutral. But if we look at what happens in terms of enforcement, who is detained, who is arrested, who is deported, it is like 90% plus Black and Brown people, and in periods like overwhelmingly Mexican, now more Central American. So in terms of that enforcement, we see that this is very clearly has its roots in racist immigration policies. Yael had a point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the history of slavery, abolition, and the civil rights movement is part of the reason why those images resonate, and the sort of erasure of some of the anti-Mexican, anti-Latino violence. I mean, not as many people are in the United States are aware of the history that Monica has written about and talked about earlier. I think then are aware of slavery, you know, the images of whipped slaves. I think that's become, I mean, it's been an effort by historians to build that up too. And I think maybe next is coming what Monica works on, which is making the history of violence against Latinos also much more well known. But I think, you know, that is partly why, you know, and that Black people were sort of criminalized first. You know, Black migrants were the first ones to be sent to criminal prisons, like federal prisons, whereas sometimes Salvadorans were sent right at that moment that Carl was talking about, where you start to see the incarceration of Central Americans too. They were sent to detention centers along the border, but not necessarily these federal prisons that had criminalized Black people. So you see like this sort of difference being drawn, even though it is applying to other asylum seekers, a subtle difference between Blacks and others. And I think in the Americas, you know, there's a lot of good scholarship now on sort of the erasure of like Black presence in the Americas. So for me, understanding how this Black violence functions in the Americas too is really, really interesting, because I think that there's this like refusal to acknowledge that kind of racism that exists in many places, or that it's not really racist, it's like something else. You know, and in Mexico dealing with Haitians, it's not really racist, maybe it's, I don't know. But so I feel like there is something about the criminalization of African Americans and Black people that is a little bit, and their positioning that is a little bit unique and also connected to other immigrants. And I think I just wanted to sort of raise that up.
Carl?
Yeah, I also just want to say on the sort of other side, while the white supremacist state criminalizes Black Americans and Black migrants and sort of drives them into the same circumstance, from time to time, it's not always the case, but we have a response of solidarity as well. So, you know, Haitians and Black Americans, some not always on the same page, sometimes there's been conflict, but in substantial numbers in the 70s, 80s, and especially in the 1990s, there's been broad solidarity campaigns where Black Americans have said, you know, we see this as racism. This is state violence against Black people. We've been experiencing this for a long time as well. And so they've joined the cause of Haitian asylum seekers, and Haitian asylum seekers have sometimes, or Haitian community has sometimes, you know, made common cause with Black Americans around their issues because, you know, it is racism and racist violence. And so there's also the potential to build solidarity there, or to recognize solidarity, and sometimes it's created effective resistance movements.
Thanks. So we have a few minutes left, and I just want to give all of the folks here an opportunity to speak to briefly what you believe we could do as academics or as immigrant advocates to stop these inhumane immigration policies and intervene in this this moment of crisis. So why don't we start with you, Monica?
Well, I mean, we have to do everything we can. I mean, that means building as many possible collaborations as possible. Also making sure that historians are looking beyond the traditional work that historians do, which is to research and write books and to speak to other historians and to speak to students in our classrooms. It's incredible how many conversations I have with students who just say, if more people knew about the history of the border, then they would have a better understanding of how immoral our current policies are. If we, you know, so much of what we have to do is just teach people history that helps us to understand, for example, the deep roots of white supremacy in immigration policies that have been in place for over a century. And we have to help people decode rhetoric that is anti-immigrant, that builds on these long histories of racist language, to criminalize people, to make them seem like a threat, and to have this, you know, it's just so many people really believe that, to Yael's point, that the strength of the nation, that one of the ways that we understand it is by the strength of our borders. And so many political campaigns have been built on being strong on border security, that as a nation, so many people have a hard time understanding that people have been criminalized, right? That even just the use of trying to explain to somebody why it is incorrect to call somebody illegal, that just, you know, that presumption of guilt, that denial of due process, that has a history in racism in our country. And we have to connect the dots between the calls for justice in immigration and the calls for racial justice in the United States, because they're connected. And too many of our politicians have been so pulled so far into these policies that participate in exacerbating fear of the border, fear of people who live near the border. And, you know, we didn't even talk about how it impacts people who are American citizens who live in mixed status families. I mean, you know, we're thinking about people who are trying to come to the United States, but we haven't even started the conversation, you know, today about how these inhumane policies rip families apart. And as a nation, we are going to have to grapple with how we repair the kinds of harm that we have committed. The last thing that I'll say is, you know, there need to be investigations, there needs to be oversight into what we've just seen, but we still don't have answers about the horrors of family separation, right? We don't know the extent of that violence, but we also don't participated in bringing that horror to life. There are still families that have not been reunited. And so there are these flashpoints when the public pays attention to the atrocities that are happening in our name, and historians have to be engaged in these moments to try to shape public understanding and above all try to decriminalize our immigration policies.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of those images of the they brought in the tractors to kind of clear that area where the Haitians were being held and kind of disappear, in a sense, the history of the violence that was enacted. And I think it's going to take journalists, advocates, historians to really document what happened there and make sure it's not just because people are removed and put on flights that history is not forgotten. Yael?
I was trying to think. I mean, I think one of my main goals is to do what Carl said, which was to like make sure that advocacy groups of different kinds kind of join forces on these issues. I think the more, alliances you can have where immigration rights groups, civil rights groups, labor unions, which have been a hard ally to kind of get on board on some issues, other rights groups, women's organizations who fight. I mean, there are sort of pockets of policy interests, and groups are very, very segmented, and advocacy groups. So bringing that together beyond even racial divides, but just sort of like expertise and focus divides. So if you can bring those people together to put enough pressure on both the Biden administration and Congress, you may get some movement on these things. And the other thing I do feel like, our foreign policy apparatus has become, the immigration issue has always had like this sort of weird relationship with our foreign policy. And I'm trying very hard to get a real, actually humanitarian and migration rights focused orientation in that apparatus, because I think, the humanitarian aid people, it's just not, they don't really think about it in the same way as immigrant rights advocates do. They don't think about migration as a sort of tactic that makes sense for many people to do, as something that like people should do. It's an adaptation to like their environment. There's nothing inherently wrong with that as an adaptation process. And I think moving the people who focus on other issues that really are humane at the end of the day, that are concerned with people, to really understand migration as something that's compatible. And I think if we actually got more folks who work on aid to really think of it, they shouldn't have, aid policies, be contingent on migration management and enforcement strategies or things like this, which is frequently what you see. I mean, I think we could, that's another sort of contingent of people that I think we could actually make some progress, especially on bringing the world back towards, pushbacks and deterring asylum seekers and sending people out to sea. This is like a worldwide problem. This is not only a problem in the United States. So sort of moving the sort of international, people who focus on international affairs in a better and more humane direction on migration issues is another thing that I think is worth doing.
Thanks, Yael. And Carl, you get the last word.
It's a lot of pressure. Yeah. I mean, I think to the extent that we have a platform as scholars or historians, we can amplify the voices and the perspectives and the demands of rights and advocacy organizations. I think that we can tell the stories of resistance and have those conversations with activists and advocates in order to, if it seems like a wise thing to do, inform those strategies. Just an example, I'm remembering recently there was a big struggle at the Bergen County Jail. I live in New Jersey, and I was outside with people doing solidarity with hunger strikers there, and they were like, what should we do, this, should we do that, this is what's happening inside. And I was like, this is what they did this one time in Miami at the Chrome Avenue Detention Center. And it wasn't automatically translatable into something, but it's like, you can tell stories of resistance, and this has worked, and they actually were able to do this at this time, and this is what happened when they tried that. So I think telling the stories of especially successful resistance. And then finally, I think one of the most revolutionary things about history is that it can be a story about imagining alternatives. So if you say something has a history, it has a beginning and it can have an end. It's not inevitable. It hasn't always been here. It was created. It can be undone. And helping to feed our radical imagination of alternative societies, worlds, policies. I think historians can play a role in that. So those are some of the things I would say.
Well, I want to thank all three of the guests, Migration Scholar Collaborative members today. I've neglected to mention my name. I'm Elliott Young. I teach at Lewis and Clark College. And I think Migration Scholar Collaborative, this is exactly what we want to do. We want to take scholars who are working on these issues and transmit somehow these ideas to journalists, to thought leaders, to the general public in accessible ways. And for those of you who don't know about Migration Scholar Collaborative, you can check us out. We have a website where there is a list, repository archived of op-eds and other public-facing scholarship. There is a recent series done by Public Books that all of the folks here today participated in. And there are many other projects that Migration Scholar Collaborative is involved with, including a project to try to legally challenge the criminalization of migration, illegal entry, and there are scholars, historians who are writing legal briefs to help with court cases against that. So hopefully we will continue these conversations with other scholars about the issues of the day. Thank you for joining us, and I really learned a lot and appreciate you all spending time with me on Sunday afternoon. Bye. Take care.